This quilt is called Inside Outside Squares, and it's a 2-block quilt, and you can download the instructions for free. Just check the description at the bottom of the video. The first block is, I call it the inside square because there's a square inside, and this is the outside square because there are 4 squares on the outside. This block, the first block, is simply a square with 2 frames, and the square in the frame and the blocks here are all cut from fat quarters. And the second block is simply a 9-patch block. These lighter fabrics are the background fabric, and then there's an additional fabric for the center. All the center squares are all the same fabric. These are cut from fat quarters, and I'm going to show you how to cut the fat quarters. Now this is how you're going to cut each fat quarter. And if you have an AccuQuilt, your 3.5-inch strip cutter and your 1.5-inch strip cutter will work really well for this. But you're going to cut 3 pieces. This is the selvage here. You're going to cut 3 at 3.5 inches. Then you're going to subcut from each one 5 squares. And then at the end, there's room to cut 1.5-inch strips. If you don't have room on this side, sometimes the fat quarters aren't exactly long enough, you can cut them out of this piece here. This is a 5.5-inch strip, and it's subcut into 6 1.5-inch segments. After you cut these, you're going to put 3 of these, 3 of the squares into your bag 1, and then you're going to put 12 squares into your bag 2. From each of the fat quarters, you'll get 6 blocks, or the squares for 6 blocks. Then you're going to match up your strips. You should have 6 small ones and 6 large ones, and put those together, and those will go into bag number 1 as well. Now follow the instructions and the pattern for cutting your background fabric. Essentially, you're just cutting strips, and you're subcutting all those strips into 1.5-inch pieces. So you'll have a number of 3.5-inch strips, 5.5-inch strips, and 7.5-inch strips. The smaller strips are going into bag number 2, and the 2 larger strips are going into bag number 1. So just cut those and put those all into the bags. Also from the background, you're going to be cutting 4 strips at 3.5 inches. And then from the center dark fabric, you will cut 2 strips at 1.5 inches. And what you're going to do with these is sew together a strip set like this, the 3.5 inch on either side of the 1.5 inch. Now all through this, I've always pressed toward the dark fabric. You can press toward the dark fabric, or you can press open, whichever you're comfortable doing. So you're going to sew 2 strip sets like this, and you're going to subcut these into 1.5-inch pieces. And here's what these segments will look like. You should get about 28 of these from each strip set, so you'll have a total of 56 of these little segments, but you only use 54. Once you cut all these, put these into bag number 2. Now it's time to start piecing block number 1 from bag number 1. And what you should do is take out your squares and match them with a set of frames. So they can coordinate or they can contrast, but match up all of your squares to all of your rectangles. You should have 1 square, and you should have 2 small rectangles and 2 large rectangles. And then we're going to piece it like this. So the smaller sides first, and then add the top and bottom, the longer sides, next. Now here's what the block looks like with the first frame on it. Now for the second frame, we're going to take two pieces that are 5.5 inches long and stitch those to the sides, and then sew 7.5 inch strip to the top and bottom. And here's your completed block 1. Now go through all the other pieces of fabric in bag 1 and you should have 54 of these blocks when you're finished. Now we'll move on to piece bag 2. For each of the different fabrics, you should have 12 squares. So divide them in half and set aside 6 squares right now. For the remaining 6 squares, we're going to sew a 3-inch strip on one side. And do that for all 6 of them. Once you're finished with that, you're going to take the remaining stack and stitch it to the other side of the strip. Now take 2 of the pieces you just sewed together and stitch to either side of one of the strip set segments you cut. And you'll do that 3 times and end up with 3 blocks.